into the politics of imperialism. Third, very briefly, I'm just going to make the point that nobody has been able to make any sort of sense of the anti-imperialist United Front of 1922, which doesn't fall within the framework of the People's Front theory of 1937. I'm not saying it's absolutely, utterly impossible for such sense to be made, but that nobody has actually succeeded in doing so. And fourthly, to talk a little bit about the words empire and imperialism and the specificity of capitalist imperialism as a phenomenon, as opposed to empire in forms, empire and expansionism in pre-capitalist forms. And then that brings us a little bit back to what communists and the workers' movement need to do about imperialism. Background to this, I actually I realised that when this handout has two sides, and side two is a whole raft of me writing on imperialism. First time around 20 years ago, in 2004, in response to the Iraq War, and the background therefore is the fact that although in the 1990s the theory of imperialism was to a considerable extent marginalised, especially around 2000 with the anti-globalisation movement and the Battle of Seattle and the World Social Forums and so on and so forth. With the American attack on Afghanistan, more particularly, in fact, with the American decision to attack Iraq, which is extremely difficult to explain in terms of, certainly impossible to explain in terms of the idea of the United States as a globocop to enforce the general requirements of capitalism, because if anything damaged capitalism as a system of the United States to attack Iraq. My own view is that the best explanation is that the attack on Iraq was intended to undermine French and German investments in Iraq, and as well as to do over a country which had dissed the United States. Nonetheless, my four elements, and that these issues are still important to us 20 years later. We're in the midst of United States proxy war in Ukraine, whose object, in my view, is to set up a full encirclement of China, to close the circle around China, and thereby create the conditions. Well, create the conditions in the first place for deindustrializing the Russian Republic, and secondly, to create the conditions for US operations which will break up and deindustrialize China. The United States is pursuing a policy of aggression on a world scale. Okay, so back to Lenin, because Lenin is the starting point, and the Communist International's views on imperialism is the starting point of the left's views on these questions. I start then with the background in the Second International debate on imperialism, and the first side of the handout gives a series of references to sources on the Second International's debate on imperialism. Within this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 steps. The first is the turn of British politics towards the celebration of imperialism, which takes place in the 1870s. The second is the scramble for Africa in the 1880s. The consequence of the scramble for Africa is the identification by Marxists of imperialism or colonialism as an important political issue. The third is the revisionism debate from 1896 onwards, which kicks off around the question of imperialism, although we think of it as being mainly about reform or revolution. In reality, the starting point is debate about imperialism. The fourth is the German genocide in Namibia, genocide of the Hereros in Namibia, and as a result of that, the Hottentot election, which was fought in Germany in 1906 between a coalition of pro-imperialist parties and the SPD, resulted in the SPD, although it didn't lose votes, losing a large number of seats because of the coalition of imperialist parties uniting the right against it. The fifth is the Morocco crisis of 1911, Agadir incident also called, and the sixth, of course, is World War I. We start then with changing meanings of, quote, imperialism. Round about 1870 to 71, imperialism in French politics meant support for the restoration of the empire, or support for the empire of Louis Bonaparte down to 1870 to 71. But after the overthrow of that, as a result of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71, imperialism was a political tendency which sought the return of the empire of Louis Bonaparte, and had been before a political tendency in French politics which sought the return of the empire of Napoleon Bonaparte as an alternative to the monarchist regimes and then to the Second Republic of 1848 to 51. Around about the same time, we get in German politics the Kaiserreich, that as a result of the wars of Germany in the 1860s and the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71, the French Empire is overthrown, but Germany relaunches itself as an empire. The Second Reich, because the First Reich is the Holy Roman Empire, which existed in theory between 800 and 1800. It seems to be connected, it's not wholly connected. Benjamin Disraeli, as Conservative leader of the Conservative Party, becomes an advocate for the Conservative Party building itself as the party of empire. In his election campaign, general election campaign of 1866, and then in the publicity which they promote around the British expedition to Abyssinia, which is British intervention in what's now Ethiopia. So the idea is that the Conservative Party should sell itself as the party of British Empire, which is also part of the same thing as one nation conservatism, which is again Disraeli. In 1876, the Royal Titles Act makes Queen Victoria Empress of India, so that she is the Queen Empress. In this sense, the presentation is partly that she's presented as the inheritrix of the Mughal Empire of Northern India, but more generally, it's the idea of England, but of the British Empire as an empire, as a world-spanning empire. Very much connected with conservative politics. Initially, the liberals were hostile to this. They said the empire is a waste of money, or section of the liberals. By the 1880s, the imperial idea has become. We've got the beginning of the emergence of a tendency in British politics called the liberal imperialists, who are a wing of the Liberal Party, who are positive advocates of empire. And at the same period, Joe Chamberlain, Birmingham local government man and manufacturer, advocate of empire protections, empire preference, imperial protection regimes, So liberal imperialism in both the sense of British expansionism, celebration of the empire, but also in the sense of the development of protectionism. Around about the same time, I said that Germany launches itself as the Second Reich from 1871. Now, Bismarck, the Prime Minister at that time, the Chancellor, is not an advocate of foreign overseas expansion. But the devices, the expansion of heavy industry, which was the basis of German victory in 1870 to 71, it enabled them to have much more powerful artillery than the French, and so on and so on. The expansion of heavy industry leads to demand for the expansion of the merchant marine, demand for German support for German railway technology exports, because the market in Germany for railways is limited. They want to break into the market, which was dominated by the British for railways in Latin America, railways in South Asia, and so on and so forth. So that we get, in spite of Bismarck, a rise of navalism. And contrary to what Karl Kautsky thought, it's actually industry, it's capitalist industry, which lobbies heavily for navalism and for imperial expansion from the 1870s onwards. So Germany, as soon as it becomes unified, as soon as it becomes a great power, which before it is not, is forced into imperial expansion, and going along with imperial expansion, the expansion of the merchant marine, navalism, and so on. Next, we get out of this. This is the context of Karl Kautsky's 1883 series Auswanderung, Kolonisation. I've got a hard copy of it somewhere, but the PDF on Friday Gabriel Stiftung seems to have gone down. This is the predecessor of Karl Kautsky's subsequent work on colonization. It's as much about emigration as it is about colonization in the context, with not just concerned with Kautsky, not just concerned with colonialism in the narrow sense, but also with German emigration to go and live in Latin America, German emigration to go and live in the United States, which there was a lot on, and so on. The scramble for Africa kicks off around 1880, and in this context, the British in Egypt, Gordon of Khartoum, Kitchener invading Sudan and Battle of Omdurman, and Ernest Belthorpe Bax, who is an English Marxist of a somewhat eccentric character, writes this article, Imperialism and Socialism, in 1885, which is originally from the first issue of Commonweal, which is the journal of William Morris and Ernest Belthorpe Bax's Socialist League, which was a split off the Social Democratic Federation. And Bax argues that capitalism is characterized by endemic overproduction, which, other things apart, would lead to a crash, and this crash would lead to socialism. But imperialism and overseas exports of capital allows capitalism to stave off the inevitable crash, the inevitable crisis, and thereby to stave off the coming of socialism. And therefore, socialists leave aside the moral aspect of it, are under a practical obligation for their own interests to oppose imperialism. Bax shows up again in the next stage of the debate, which is 1896. And in 1896, the kickoff is that Eduard Bernstein argues for SPD support for what we would now call humanitarian intervention against the Turkish state in defense of the Armenians. And he argues that there's no grounds for the SPD or the socialist left to oppose humanitarian interventions because the expansion of capitalism tends to bring with it civilization. The expansion of capitalism, in modern terminology again, is historically progressive. And this is the kickoff of the Bernstein, of the revisionism debate. It is Bax responds with the exact same argument that he ran in 1885. Kautsky initially backs Bernstein on this. He thinks that Bax was putting forward reactionary anti-capitalism. Then we get interventions from Rosa Luxemburg and from Parvus, these interventions shift the terms of the debate. They force Kautsky to come out against Bernstein. And meanwhile, it's also side by side with this. Parvus wrote an important series of articles in the Neue Zeit called The Agrarian Question of World Economy, the World Economy and the Agrarian Question, which is an intervention in the debate in the SPD about the agrarian question. The right wing of the SPD urged subsidies to peasant farming and political alliance between the SPD and the pro-farmer peasant parties. Parvus argues that the decline of peasant farming in Germany is an inevitable consequence of the development of the world market in agricultural products, particularly the world market in grain, which Germany was importing very large quantities of grain from what's now Ukraine, but also from Poland and elsewhere. Actually, although Parvus doesn't pick up on this, around about the same time, the invention of refrigerated shipping results in the European meat market, meat production being undermined by imports from Australia, New Zealand, Argentina. Parvus argues that even small-scale domestic issues, domestic as it were, issues like the agrarian question, are unresolvable outside of the frame of recognizing the presence of the world economy. Same period, Max Beer writes an article on the English politics of imperialism. And what Beer's starting point is the recognition of the liberals' opposition to imperialism in the 1850s and 1860s and into the 1870s. But he theorizes this in a more extensive way than just this was the liberals having a go at the Tories over the question of imperial titles and expenditure. He argues that using Bax's theory, he argues that capitalism in its progressive phase is anti-imperialist. And that capitalism, industrial capitalism in its progressive phase is anti-imperialist. And that as it comes to the end of its progressive phase, it becomes imperialist. And that's where he sees Disraeli's imperialism project, political imperialism project, as being grounded. I don't think Max Beard actually did any serious work on the history of the British Empire in the 19th century. He's just writing essentially. If we think about it, it's a speculative article in the Neue Zeit, which is a weekly. We tend to overestimate how theoretically developed the Neue Zeit, the stuff in the Neue Zeit is. But we think about how quickly we write, the people who write for the Weekly Worker write. The Neue Zeit stuff is going to be largely of the same character. Okay, so Palmas is also an early intervener in the second stage of the revisionism debate, which is the naval estimates debate, because the German right wing argued that the SPD ought to be willing to vote for the naval estimates, either on the basis that it's creating employment for shipyard workers, or on the basis that Germany is under real threat from being closed off from foreign markets by the British, and therefore German industry as a whole, and therefore German proletariat objectively needs a big navy. So we get, Palmas writes a pamphlet in response to this, which again deploys the Bax theory of imperialism as a result of capitalist overproduction leads to imperialism, and that imperialism represents a decline in capitalism in the same context. Kautsky writes his three-part series on colonialism, which Ben Lewis translated and we published as a pamphlet booklet. And what Kautsky does is to elaborate, in the introduction to it, I've argued that the history is very unsound, but essentially Kautsky elaborates this theory of that imperialism is derived from, the significance of imperialism is derived from the decline of capitalism. But it's also decline of capitalism in the sense that it's the ascendancy, a return to the ascendancy of pre-capitalist classes. That it's the gentry. It's Kautsky's three-part series is, in my view, very Anglophile. It sees the British Empire as purely a defensive response to the French and German imperialism and Russian imperialism. And French and German imperialism and Russian imperialism, capitalism finding an insufficient space for its domestic development, enters into historic compromise alliance with the landed aristocracy, and that alliance supports the development of imperialism. Okay, after 1898, this debate is muted for about 7 or 8 years. It moves, the topics of debate in the Second International move successively, first onto the coalition question and Millerandism, the issue of Alexandre Millerand, into the French government. There's a big debate in Germany about the Baden SPD supporting the budget of the Liberals. And then 1904, 1905, it moves on to the Russian Revolution and the mass strike debate and stuff like that. But then, as I said, Germany launches a genocidal campaign of suppression of the Herreros. And the SPD opposes, it's a perfectly principled thing to do, the SPD opposes the Herero genocide. And all the capitalist parties unite against the SPD, liberals and conservatives alike, in a bloc round support for imperialism and German nationalism. The election which follows is referred to as the Hottentot election. The Herreros, otherwise called the Hottentots. That this is a bloc of the capitalist parties in defense of the genocide of the Herreros. And the SPD, as I said, although its total share of the vote actually goes up, coalition of all the capitalist parties results in the SPD massively losing seats. And in this context, the right wing of the SPD argues that it's necessary to have a, quote, constructive colonial policy rather than a ultra-leftist anti-colonial policy. And that policy, that view of constructive colonial policy is also supported by the right wing of the Dutch socialists at the Congress of the Socialist International in 1907. It's in that context that Parvus writes a book called Colonial Policy and Collapse. Ben has translated that, but it hasn't been published as a whole, basically because the guys at Historical Materialism published sufficiently large extracts of Parvus's book that it's not worth trying to publish the whole thing. And Kautsky writes an article called Socialism and Colonial Policy, or a pair of articles called Socialism and Colonial Policy, which both of which, again, we're still using the Back's theory, but Parvus elaborates on the role of finance capital in particular in this context. So the Parvus is much more elaborate political economy. The Parvus book is the really elaborate political economy of developing the Back's concept of imperialism. Kautsky explicitly, he talks about going to follow Parvus on the political economy question. The issue then resurfaces again in 1911, 1912, arising out of the Italian invasion of Libya, colonization of Libya, connected with the Italian colonization of Libya, the First and Second Balkan Wars, and connected with both of these, the Agadir incident, the Morocco crisis, the Second Morocco crisis, which is essentially about whether Morocco is going to be a French dependency or going to be subject to a, quote, open door policy of the sort which was being argued for China at the same period, that the imperialists should all have access to the Chinese economy. This was US and US policy in relation to China. And there was a war crisis. There was a threat. The Germans sent a cruiser to Agadir, and there was a threat that Germany allowing one of its naval vessels to dock at Agadir was going to be a casus belli, that the war was, European war was going to break down. So the consequence of the Morocco crisis and the continuously go on First and Second Balkan Wars, where the Serbia, Bulgaria, etc., invade and take territory of the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans, then subsequently fall out among themselves about how this territory is to be divvied up. There are, I'm not going to go into it because it's, there are issues about which of the rival imperialist powers were sponsoring which of the Balkan powers. Serbia and Romania were essentially French clients. Bulgaria was closer to being a German client. Parvus, who I referred to above, is in Istanbul at this date, having gone to Istanbul as a journalist. I'm not quite sure on behalf of whom, made a fortune in insider trading in connection with the Ottoman war effort in the First Balkan War, and became a millionaire. and close ally of the Young Turkish nationalist movement, wrote lots of articles for the Young Turk journals. And I guess this is just my guess, but my guess is this informs how Parvus subsequently develops. Okay, 1911 to 12. The SPD leadership proposes international arms limitation treaties and compulsory arbitration of disputes between states, which is sort of, okay, arms limitation treaties. It's the strategic arms limitation treaties of the 1960s and 70s, or the arbitration between states is today's International Court of Justice. I think after 100 years of the existence of these institutions, we can see reasonably clearly how much they are worth. The left argues this. Here we're talking about Luxembourg, Pannekoek, Hermann Gorter, Heinrich Kuno, Paul Lensch, argued that imperialism is an inevitable stage of capitalism, and that it's illusory to suppose that you could get the imperialists to agree to arms limitation treaties. The only option which is available is to overthrow socialist revolution. Is the only alternative to the drive towards war. So in 1914, we arrive actually at the war, and the war then generates Gorter's book on imperialism as the origin of the war, Bukharin's Imperialism and World Economy. It's written in 1914-15, not published until 1917. Lenin and Zinoviev on the social roots of opportunism. So we get these, but none of these are representing a fundamental shift in the theory of imperialism. On the other side of the story, Parvus argues, he's in Istanbul, and he argues for Turkish entry into the war on the German side. And he argues that the reason for Turkish entry into the war on the German side is that German victory will allow the Ottomans to escape from the forcible subordination to Britain and France. They'd been under what would now be called IMF intervention, in which the Turkish tax administration was entirely controlled by the creditors, that is to say, Britain and France. And the British and French had extraterritoriality, so that no British or French citizen could be convicted of any offence in any Turkish court, or indeed at all, practically. So Parvus argues that Turkish entry, that German victory will allow the Turks, but more generally, that British and French victory will lead to the partitioning of the Ottoman Empire, which turned out to be unambiguously the case. But more generally, that the German Empire was more historically progressive than the British Empire. And German capitalism was organized capitalism as opposed to the disorganized aristocratic liberalism, which is a late form of absolutism. And this view was picked up by Heinrich Kuno, by Max Beer, by Paul Lensch, who I referred to, this group who formed the Die Glocke group. So it's worth flagging this. There's a bunch of guys at the center collapsed on the occasion of the First World War, Kautsky and Co. The right wing it's unsurprising that the right wing will for the victory of their own movement. The centre collapsed, It's also the case that a substantial part of the left collapsed. And we can see that it's not just the Germans, these guys. It's also Benito Mussolini was one of the central leaders of the left wing of the Italian Socialist Party before the war broke out, and he became gung-ho for Italian victory. And through being an Italian nationalist socialist, becomes the leader of fascism. We can think of these guys organized capitalism. This was Hilferding's argument, but it was, in a sense, we can think of this similarly. Will Hutton more recently talks about the advanced capitalism of Europe as opposed to the backward capitalism of England and the United States. Martin Jakes says even if China's capitalism, it's a more advanced form of capitalism than the United States and Britain. This is very similar to the arguments which the De Glocker guys ran in 1914-16. But it's not sort of totally untrue in the sense, if we actually think about what happened when Britain finally was defeated, the destruction of the British Empire, through the fact that Britain had to give up its empire to the United States by agreement in 1940, and then trying to wiggle out in 1944 and failing, and then trying to wiggle out in 1956 and failing, allowed a new phase of intense capitalist development between the 1950s and the 1970s. So the De Glocker guys were right as against Lenin, in the sense, Lenin and Bukharin, in the sense that they understood that the fundamental problem with capitalism in the early 20th century was the British Empire, rather than that capitalism itself was coming to an end. 1916, we have the Easter Rising, and Lenin is engaged in a debate with the, quote, imperialist economists, including Bukharin and others. What attitude should we take? Should we take the view of Rosa Luxemburg, Hermann Gorter, and others, that nationalism under these circumstances is always and invariably reactionary, and therefore that we regard the Easter Rising as a simple putsch attempt by reactionaries? Or should we actually support the Easter Rising? And it's at this point Lenin sees the draft of Bukharin's Imperialism World Economy. He drafts his introduction to it well before publication. And so the question which arises is, why should Lenin write something else? Okay, he represents the imperialism, higher stage of capitalism, as being written with a view to the censorship, as being written with a view to a popular exposition. It's not actually the case that Bukharin's Imperialism and World Economy is a difficult book. The reality is that there are substantial differences in the substance. So Bukharin argues that imperialism will necessarily issue in the conflicts between imperialist powers will necessarily issue in the creation of a super-imperialist, a top-dog imperialist power, which forces all the other countries in subordination to itself. We could infer from that you would get a hierarchy of states with the top-dog imperialist power and subordinate imperialist powers and subordinate middle-rank powers and the colonies at the bottom of it. I don't think that's a conclusion which Bukharin actually reaches, but you could do that. Secondly, Bukharin argues that imperialism involves not just monopoly, but the integration of capital in the state. and statisation. And as a result of statisation, the working class is tied into loyalty to capital through loyalty to the state. It's the loyalty of the working class to the state which gives rise to loyalty to capital. It's not a direct loyalty to capital. And that goes along with, again, the Luxembourg, the imperialist economists, the communist tendency more generally, Kollontai, the argument for the abolition of the state, that the crisis of capitalism poses the question of the abolition of the state rather than a worker state. Thirdly, for Bukharin, imperialism is tied to the development of world economy. So if we go back to the arguments of Parvus for world economy in the 1890s, and back to actually the arguments for the inherent world economy character in the Parvus-Trotsky version of permanent revolution in 1905. We sort of read Trotsky's permanent revolution through the Trotskyists who toned it down. Trotsky already radically toned it down in 1930 because what he wrote in 1905-6, he argued that the Soviet regime couldn't survive as long as it survived until 1930. So that this and similarly, Trotsky in this period is arguing for the United States of Europe, which Lenin argues is a reactionary slogan because it would mean Europe as a unified imperialist exploiter rather than anything else. It has been said Parvus is also arguing for the United States of Europe, and he goes on arguing in 1916 what Parvus wants to see is the United States of Europe imposed by German force of arms. But in 1918-19, Parvus is arguing for the United States of Europe, and he enters into coalitions with those capitalists who are willing to argue for the United States of Europe. Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, on the other hand, in the first place, there is no super-imperialism. Lenin's imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, the war literally represents the end state of capitalism. Any peace which occurs in the immediate aftermath of the war is going to be short-lived. The Comintern, influenced by these ideas, continue to predict the immediate emergence of new wars. And in fact, it took 20 years for Great Power War to come back in 1939. There won't be a super-imperialism. There's just an endless struggle for the redivision of the world in a zero-sum game between the imperialist great powers. Secondly, Lenin's imperialism is much flatter. There are two classes: the exploited powers, which are the imperialists, and the exploited powers, which are either colonies or on the road to becoming colonies. So Portugal, for example, in spite of the fact Portugal itself has colonies, Lenin interpreted Portugal as being on the road to becoming a colony. This is a misunderstanding of what's actually going on, which is Portugal was and had been since the 1660s a dependency of Britain. But it was a dependency of Britain which also had its own colonial possessions. It was, in fact, in some senses, a post-imperial. Portugal had been a very early imperial operator, albeit the finance capital aspect of Portuguese imperialism was from Genoa. So that you don't get, it's very difficult, it's less easy to see Portugal as an imperialist power because the capital is Genoese capital rather than Portuguese capital, which is driving this imperialism. Lenin flattens these cases. Secondly, in Lenin's anti-imperialism the highest stage, the creation of working class loyalty is not through the state, but direct loyalty of a section of the working class to a section of capital through buying off, through the creation of a labor aristocracy. And thirdly, imperialism, the highest stage, it's literally the highest stage, it's the terminal stage. It's what Lukács calls the actuality of the revolution, the immediacy of revolutionary crisis. The immediacy of revolutionary crisis is posed in spite of the relatively low level of proletarianization globally. And therefore, hence the conclusion in relation to the Easter Rising, that the rising of the petty bourgeoisie is a necessary element of the proletarian revolution. So, faced with, as it were, the choice between Bukharin's theory of imperialism and Lenin's theory of imperialism in 2021, the Comintern adopts basically Lenin's theory of imperialism. And we get, in consequence, the idea that its strategically central element of the global proletarian revolution is the victory of the anti-imperialist forces. But now I come to my rather brief point. This turns out to be a trap. It turns out to be a trap. We can already see it in the experience of the Turkish Communist Party with Kemal Atatürk in the 1920s. And we can already see it actually, although Trotsky imagined that there could have been a different outcome, but I don't think we necessarily have to accept Trotsky's idea that there could have been a different outcome in relation of the Chinese Communist Party, the Kuomintang. The Chinese Communist Party grew from 50 to 20,000 or something like that in entry in the Kuomintang, but of course, very rapidly, the Kuomintang turned on the Chinese Communist Party and crushed it in 1927. And the subsequent history of the Chinese Communist Party, to the extent that it actually had success and took power, was not through alliance with the Kuomintang to defeat imperialism, but through an independent, militarily and politically independent struggle, which was alongside the KMT, but was not an anti-imperialist united front. It was, except in the sense that they were both shooting at the Japanese during the war with Japan, but that didn't stop the KMT shooting at the communists or the communists shooting at the KMT. So my inference from this stuff is actually the Leninist version doesn't work. I don't think the Bukharin version in itself works either, but I'll just go briefly into why. Very briefly, I start with empire and imperialism. The roots of this idea in the Roman Empire. Imperium is the Latin word for military command. Imperator is a successful general. It becomes then spread from imperium as military command to imperium as the military command which Rome has over its dependent provinces which have been conquered or made into client states. And the imperator, hence, because it's a military dictatorship, the regime, the Roman regime from 27 BCE through to 313 CE is a disguised military dictatorship which pretends to be a republic. And the emperor is then the imperator, the princeps, he's called in Augustus's time, the headman, the most senior senator. The dominus, he's called from Constantine, Christian Emperor Constantine's time, owner, boss. The economic formation of this regime, the economic element is slave taking through war, is the origin or basis of the supply of slaves. In the early empire, in the late Republic and the early empire, the Rome exacts tribute from conquered territories and provinces. And tribute is what it's called. And Italy is made tax-free. Italian land is tax-free because there's so much money coming in from the provinces that we don't need to charge taxes on Italian land. The jurist Gaius tells us that the empire owns, the state owns all the land in the provinces. And what these guys are paying is not really tax, it's rent. But under Diocletian and Galerius, that fiction breaks down, and Diocletian and Galerius reimpose the land tax on Italy. So it's just tax. And the result is that you've got a large territorial area which is flat. Within the territorial area, the social relations are the same. Britain is not being exploited by Rome. Africa is not being exploited by Rome. The slaves are being exploited. The guys beyond the frontier are being exploited because slave taking continues outside the frontiers, because Rome's theory is everybody who isn't in a province or in a treaty with us is at war with us, and therefore private operators can raid across the borders and take slaves from the neighbours. The Brits raid into Ireland and take slaves, and the Irish raid into Britain and take slaves. Chinese regime operates in a very similar way, that you get flat internal relations, but a very sharp gradient of exploitation across the borders of the empire. Now, the imperial idea, the idea of the empire, as I said, it gets attached. The King Charlemagne of the Franks is crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope in 800 AD, 800 CE. And that idea of the empire is inherited by the Germans. And the consequence of that is that we get, because this is an image of the reunification of Europe from the regime of nation states, which is created by feudalism. And the consequence of that is that we get imperialismo as a political tendency in Italy, which is alternately called Ghibellines. There's Guelphs who are papalists and Ghibellines who are imperialists, who are in favour of the German emperor running the show. These are actually political tendencies of the rising bourgeoisie seeking a universal power which doesn't exist, and factionalising the city-states which do exist in the hope of unification through the empire or unification through the Pope. This is a political reading, doesn't involve economic exploitation. The same way there is economic expansionism of Europe. What's called the Drang nach Osten, the Germans move east. We can equally talk about the English moving into Wales, the English moving into Ireland, the English moving into Scotland. But again, this doesn't create a hierarchy of countries. The reason is because it's too easy for the guys on the other side of the border to copy. So we get the Kingdom of Scotland copying the techniques of the Kingdom of England. We get the Kingdom of Poland, the Kingdom of Bohemia copying the techniques of the feudal techniques of the Kingdom of Germany. Or we get the English in Ireland becoming the, quote, Old English, i.e. the ones who were acculturated to Irish practice and became merely Irish. You can say the same thing of the Marcher Lords in Wales. They acculturate. The English who colonised southern Scotland acculturate and become Scots. If in 1216, King John had not died, and the Kingdom of England had gone to the son of the King of France, and England north of Humber had gone to Scotland, the guys north of Humber would think of themselves as Scots at the present day. So with the emergence of interstitial capitalism, with the Italian city-states, with Venice and Genoa, equally with the city-states of the Hanse and of the Netherlands in the North Sea and Baltic economic area, we get a new form of domination in which the state power is used to hold other territories in economic subordination. And we get overseas bases of both Venice and Genoa, and subsequently of the Netherlands all the way around to Taiwan. And we get plantation colonies of Venice, setting up plantations for slave work sugar production on Cyprus and Crete. Genoa setting up Portuguese slave work sugar plantations on Atlantic islands of one sort. So this subordinates the colonies as low value added producers. Colonies, or for that matter, in the Netherlands radically subordinates Poland as a grain producer to feed the cities of the Netherlands. So that we get an institutional subordination. And this institutional subordination is inherent to capitalism. We can see it's inherent to capitalism. It's the same bloody thing which is there in the 13th and 14th century small-scale Venetian and Genoese imperial operations, is there globally in the ascendancy of the Netherlands, and is there in the United States, the Empire of the United States after 1945. The oddball thing is the territorial empires, and the territorial empires, European territorial empires, I think, follow from the fact that the British accidentally captured northern India, and having accidentally captured northern India, everybody else imitates the British Empire in India for a period of time. Back to the left, anti-imperialist, quote, victory to the Iraqi resistance, victory to the Iranian regime against imperialism is delusional. It isn't in fact. Lenin's judgment about what was going on was wrong in relation to this. This policy has failed to work over a very long period of time. On the other hand, the anti-imperialism, which we've got with the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, with Platypus, with the Eustonites, with etc., is just Bernstein redivivus, the image that imperialism is going to make progress and bring progress to the world, and human emancipation through friendly bonds. the consequence, therefore, the tasks of the communists in the imperialist countries are well judged by the Comintern. It is true that the communists in the imperialist countries have to fight for the defeat of their own country's imperialist operations. What was maljudged was both the idea that victory toism was going to be a radical step forward, and the idea that there's a single line. The Trotskyists, you have to have one line which says X should win. It's the job of the Trotskyists to fight for victory to the Taliban, wherever the hell they are. The reality is that the tasks of communists in colonial countries are not the same as the tasks of communists in imperialist countries. Grasping imperialism in a way which isn't the Leninist theory is fundamental to understanding that. Okay, I'm sorry to have overrun something.